Okay, well, it's a couple of minutes past 2, and one or two people just still coming in through the waiting room. But I think as you're all here, we'll make a start now. And a very warm welcome to the 8th of the COVID conversations that EDAS has been running. Who would have thought when we started the first one back in the spring, we'd still be going strong deep into the winter? But there we are. That's the strange year it's been. So today's topic is innovation for recovery. The start of the vaccinations today helps us turn our thoughts, I suppose, very much from the sort of survival mode to the recovery mode. And the pandemic has forced many of us in public, private, and voluntary sectors to innovate, survive, and to deliver vital products and services. I was intrigued actually to see a report from McKinsey's recently that suggested that depending on what topic you were looking at, that the pandemic had speeded up trends that were already emerging, but speeded them up from anything between 3 and 10 years. I mean, if that is the case, then that is really quite something. So we've got some considerable challenges to face as we go forward, some related to COVID, others much more long-standing. Perhaps the pandemic provides an opportunity for a reset, but there are a lot of questions outstanding. For example, to what extent does the inventiveness that's marked the innovation for survival provide lessons and a platform for investment and innovation for sustainable recovery in the future? And what will need to be done, particularly from those of us in the economic development community, to support the necessary innovation in products and services, new business models, new processes. So there's a whole raft of stuff. And I'm really pleased to say that we've got a really wide-ranging panel to stimulate thinking and discussion today from a number of different perspectives. I'd like to give a warm welcome to Adam Lang, who's the head of Nesta in Scotland, to David McIntosh, Associate Director of the Scottish Futures Trust, and to Barbara Mills, the Programme Manager at Civtech, who are going to be our panel for today. So we're going to have an introductory comments from each of the panel members, and then we'll move on to a Q&A session. Use the chat box, use it for posing questions. I'll try and pick questions up from the chat box, but also use it for conversation as well, posting interesting links. And we'll aim to get finished by 3 o'clock. So I think without any further ado, there's some information on the screen there just for the ways of sharing things. So yes, without further ado, let's get started. So Adam, over to you. Innovation for recovery.
Thank you very much, Charlie, and thank you for the invitation to be here today in such great company. It's a real privilege and a pleasure. I hope not to make too much of a fool of myself in such esteemed company. So I'm head of Nesta in Scotland, and just very briefly for anyone that might not be familiar with Nesta, Nesta is the UK Innovation Foundation. We were established about 20 odd years ago, originally as an arm's length body of government in Whitehall, created with an endowment from the National Lottery at the time. However, over the last 20 years, 2 decades, we have moved out of being an arm's length body of government, and we're now an independent charity seeking to advance innovation for social good. So in that context, it's a real pleasure to come and speak today. I've been in post for a couple of years now, leading the work of Nesta in Scotland and seeking to build our work and our engagement. And I think that it's a fantastic time to be in this role in this place, because it's a really exciting moment for social innovation in Scotland in a broader context. And it was great to be invited along today to chat about the role of innovation in its broadest sense, social innovation, economic innovation, in relation to recovery and renewal in Scotland. We're obviously are in the middle of, or perhaps, or living through some of the strangest and most uncertain and some of the most difficult days that I think any of us have. And I think it's not easy and possibly also not entirely wise to get into the game of second guessing exactly what the long-term impacts of some of the things we're living through at the moment might be. So there's no shortage of sort of great speculations one way or another. And every time I think, oh, that's interesting, that idea. And then if I see one on the other side, it's all right, okay, well, maybe it's not so interesting anymore. But definitely these are days that are changing a lot of who we and what we are in Scotland, and asking us to sort of grapple with some difficult questions. And so in sort of opening my remarks, I just wanted to sort of acknowledge that when we talk about recovery in Scotland, there's an important question of recovery to what? Because before the public health crisis that we're living through at the moment, we had a huge raft of problems confronting us as a society, not just in our economy, but obviously deeply connected and linked to our economy. Poverty, inequality, homelessness, in-work poverty, low pay, precarious work, stagnant wages. We had social care challenges, we had pressures on our public services across the board. We had deep inequality in our economy as it was, let alone how it might emerge on the other side of this. So I'm not a doom monger. I'm not saying that everything is terrible. It is not. You know, there are many, many things to be incredibly proud of about living and working in Scotland and contributing to our society. But we can't deny that we have significant structural and deep-rooted systemic challenges in our society. So when we think about recovery and the role of innovation in that recovery to what is an important question to ask, and there's many great organisations and great people grappling with this at this moment in time. And that's, for me, that's why I deliberately wanted to sort of insert the word renewal. I know that there's a bit of a kind of, at times in Scotland, we're quite bad for being a bit tribal in these things and splitting hairs about, is it renewal? Is it build back better? Is it, you know, what's the right hashtag to use? And I don't personally sort of want to get too much into that. I think we can all share the ambition that we want to progress. We want a more inclusive, a more sustainable society. So I think we had these very specific challenges to us in Scotland, and I think they were exacerbated as well by some of the more existential challenges that we're facing across the globe at the moment. Our climate crisis, our changing demographics, our aging population, the fourth industrial revolution, which is impacting on not just our world of work, although that's often the place it's discussed most, but it's also impacting on our social lives, the way we engage and interact with people, the information and media that we consume, the type of democracy that we live in, the ways in which we participate and connect across our society. So the world is changing rapidly around us. And I think that, combined with those specific challenges, social and economic, that we face in Scotland, mean that we've got a big task on our hands when we think about renewal and recovery. And it's with that in mind that my first point, if I may make one of a few here just briefly, is that I think a big part of what has to change is some of our working culture. And I mean that in its broadest sense. We need to acknowledge that more of the same, or more of the same that won't be enough to rise to the challenges that we face. It wasn't enough already to grapple with the systemic challenges that we were enduring. So it's not going to be enough to come out of this public health crisis and rise to the compounded and exacerbated challenges that we're going to face, and indeed already are facing. So I think part of the first point I would want to make is I think there's now a really important moment in time for a change in mindset towards greater collaboration, greater experimentation across public services, across the economy, across interventions that we seek to make to support equality and engagement. And what I would say that's encouraging about that, because I'm not naive about this, it's all very well and good for someone like me who's interested in these things to sit here and say we should do this, you know, blah, blah, blah. But I recognize and entirely accept these are very difficult cultural working norms to try and change, whether it be from national government, local government, or businesses, you know, SMEs, major corporations. They're not things that change quickly or overnight, and they're not easy to change. But I think that my view is that we do have to grapple with that change process, because more of the same won't cut it. Scotland has, you know, a sort of a mixed economy in a lot of ways. You know, we're sort of 98 or 99% of registered businesses in Scotland are SMEs, and you know, about 50% of the workforce are employed in SMEs in the private sector, and the other 50% are employed in larger organisations. So we have a diverse and a mixed economy, We have areas of fantastic productivity and performance, whether it's life sciences, advanced manufacturing, data, environmental and renewables. And that's fantastic and something for us to be very proud of, but it isn't where the majority of people work. And so my second point, my first was around mindset and culture. My second point is about inclusivity. It's all very well and good having high growth strategies for certain sectors or certain areas, but not at the cost of leaving people behind. And I think, if anything, the pandemic has shown us the absolute vital importance of the foundational economy, the economy that keeps supermarket shelves stacked, that keeps delivery drivers, getting whether it's your Amazon or your local shop or whatever it might be, if that foundational economy that has kept us all connected and fed and kept our services going during the pandemic, I think that's now more important than ever. And I think for me, and for in relation to Nesta's work, I think it's about time that we thought about the foundational economy in the same way that we do traditionally some of these high growth sectors or high innovation sectors. What would an innovation strategy for the foundational economy look like? What would an innovation strategy look like for retail or for care? I think these are equally worthy of attention compared to some of the traditional high growth economic areas. So I think my second point is around that inclusion agenda. There's then the points about regional inequality. We hear a lot in the news at a UK-wide level about the discrepancies between the southeast of England and the rest of the UK in terms of R&D expenditure and UKRI investment, et cetera. But if we bring that closer to home in Scotland, we have similar challenges here. Now, in many ways, we're doing great things, and I think we should again be rightly proud of some of the efforts that have been made with the South of Scotland Enterprise, the Scottish National Investment Bank. There's great stuff going on, but a lot of our government expenditure and R&D is still heavily skewed towards the central belt in part. And we know that this contributes and compounds issues around productivity and growth and equality of opportunity in terms of employment. So I think we have to think about these things for Scotland as well. We have this challenging sort of conflicting sort of opportunities in Scotland, if you like, in that we're a sort of a Goldilocks country in some ways, in that we're the right size population-wise to sort of learn from some progressive and inclusive and economically successful small European nations, the Nordics or other such places. There's a lot that we can sort of learn, and I know that we are engaged on many fronts in that agenda. But we also have big regional challenges, geographical challenges about the way our population is dispersed, the size of some of our local authorities, the structure of our public services, and our various institutions of state that go towards supporting the economy. And it's a sort of a double-edged sword in that regard. We've got some real strengths and opportunities, which in turn can be drivers of innovation. Rural locations in some ways have done some of the most advanced thinking in relation to things such as drones and automation for rural delivery purposes, just as one example of many. But it's a sort of uniquely, well, not uniquely, I know there are other countries, but it's a Scotland-specific challenge that we should see as an opportunity to drive inclusive innovation. So I think tackling our regional inequality is a really important point. And my final sort of point in that regard of my kind of four things that I wanted to mention is sort of, okay, well, those are all sort of well-trodden areas, so what can we do about it? I think mindset change is part of it, but I think there's a sort of second point around this concept of mission-led innovation. I know that innovation is I work for an innovation foundation, we use it a lot. It's a bit of a catch-all term, and it can mean different things to different people. And it's certainly at times overused or misapplied. But it can be a really important vehicle. And I think that's particularly true when we think about mission-led innovation. And some of that we've seen arise ad hoc in the context of the pandemic, the pivot that was made towards provision of things like PPE, or the incredible advances in vaccine, today of all days, of vaccine development, and shows what can be achieved when society has a shared purpose and is willing to fund and back, and citizens as well are willing to engage. If you think about the enormous number of citizens that have engaged in the vaccine trials, of volunteering to be part of that, these are things that are usually significant barriers to development, or at least can delay development. So I think when we think about missions and when we think about mission-led innovation, there is a real opportunity to harness the potential of innovation in relation to the economic opportunities, strengths, and the challenges that Scotland faces, and shift it towards some of those big existential challenges, whether it's the climate crisis, the demographic changes that we're seeing, or the more specific ones that we know exist in Scotland in relation to some of those long-standing and intractable social issues around poverty and inequality and low productivity. So I think there's a really important role for mission-led innovation as a driver of economic growth, but also as a driver of social innovation, or enabler of social innovation, because whilst we've been talking primarily today, and understandably given the forum, about the role of innovation in the economy does not stand alone from other key institutions and pillars of our society in Scotland. I think we need to think about mission-led innovation in relation to our democracy, in relation to our public finances, in relation to our skills agenda and how we upskill, reskill, give the right skills to our younger people. So I think there's many interconnected points. None of it's easy. A lot of it for me starts with an acknowledgement of that and a willingness to embrace a new mindset. And whilst all of that sounds incredibly, difficult, challenging, a bit utopian perhaps at times, I would sort of close my remarks by saying that we did a bit of work back in February. It started before the public health crisis, but we did this in February, and it was around trying to understand Scottish public attitudes towards innovation. And we published a report, and I think it was in February. Time's lost all meaning in the last few months. I think it was February. But it showed that the Scottish public were really supportive of this concept of mission-led innovation. And they, in their responses, we did a representative sample of the population, they wanted to see the climate crisis identified as the #1 priority for innovation across society. And when you dug into some of the findings a bit further, there was some really interesting stuff in there. 69% of people in Scotland recognise that trying, failing, learning are key to progressing. Experimentation is a key part of advancing society forward. And there was other interesting findings in there that were around people's willingness to share their data, their personal data, if they knew that it was going towards a mission-led social cause. So I think there's a lot, I mentioned that just as a kind of final thought, that there's a lot in this space that can feel difficult. It can feel slightly too idealistic at times, but I actually believe that it's very much grounded in where people are. This is the kind of society that people want to see and want us to be. So I think it's the opportunity now is on us, and the responsibility is on us to embrace that, to rise to those challenges, and to take this opportunity that has arisen out of the most trying and difficult and tragic of circumstances with the pandemic, to seek to come out of it better, to come out of it with a more mission-led approach that embraces innovation to tackle some of the biggest societal challenges we face right now. So I'll stop there because I'm very guilty of talking too much, but I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here. I look forward to hearing all the other speakers and being part of the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Adam, for a great kickoff there. Gives a lot to think about. Interesting, that idea of the mission-led innovation, sort of focus on the climate crisis, given that that's where a lot of our attention, I would imagine, will be focused next year as we head towards the COP conference in Glasgow. So could be interesting timing there for that. David, over to you for our second contribution.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to contribute today. I'm actually joining the EDAS board as of tomorrow, I think it is, Charlie. So hopefully I get this right and show that was a good decision, Charlie. So there's three areas that I'd like to focus on, actually, and really delighted with Adam's first part there, because I think a lot of it's going to actually chime. So the first part is innovation during COVID, where I'll talk a little bit about the PPE experience. Second part is about how we might draw some of those lessons forward, and that's really a bit of a prompt for all of the colleagues that have joined today to take some thinking away from today. And the third piece is about the innovation landscape in Scotland, which we're going to find as part of our recovery. I think it's really changing pretty dynamically at the moment, and I think it's something that needs to be better understood. So first part on innovation in COVID. Just as a quick introduction, I spent a lot of time working either embedded in government with other public sector bodies like local authorities, or somewhere in the space between. And in March, I was invited in by government to join a cross-government agency team working on the provision of PPE. I actually set up the initial process to handle inquiries at the start of March. And I worked on it for 55 days with a huge team of people across government. 55 days for me. Many colleagues worked on it, including the Minister, Ivan McKee, for 180 days straight. And I think when we all look back on that experience, I think we can look back on it with some real pride in the way that Scotland approached that issue compared to other countries in the way they approached PPE. So why is this important for innovation? Well, I think there's 4 really interesting conditions that applied to innovation in the context of COVID. Four conditions. The first one chimes with what Adam was talking about. It was a national mission, a very clear national mission to quadruple ICU capacity in Scotland as quickly as possible and to gather sufficient PPE to service our health service. Very, very clear mission. I've read Mariana Mazzucato's books. I've read and I understand mission-orientated goals. That's the clearest mission I've ever had to work on. So the mission was there. The second one is really important in an innovation context, and that's that there was a very clear demand signal and product specification to the market. So we knew we were going to buy it, and we knew what we needed. And those product specifications for ventilators and masks and other items of PPE actually got better as we went, and we were able to give the market clear demand signal. Really important when we think about innovation. The third thing is actually something we underplay in Scotland, and it actually goes back to Adam's point about Scotland's size. We were able very quickly to access the Scottish business base through our enterprise agencies, organisations like NMIS, SMAS, through the ministers who actually, call for arms for PPE and medical supplies. We accessed the Scottish business base unbelievably quickly, and boy, did they respond. It was a real call to arms that was met by the Scottish business base to meet this particular challenge. The fourth condition is really interesting, and that's actually a bit more complex, and that's to do with funding and procurement when it comes to public sector-led investment. So we were able, in a time of crisis, to actually really rethink procurement, and I think that only happens once once in a blue moon, to be honest with you. But we're able to look at procurement differently, work with procurement bodies, look at funding differently, and approach that in a different way. And the outcome of all of that and those conditions actually is, I think, Scotland proved to itself that we can be highly innovative when required. It was really something quite amazing to be part of. We were able to create resilient supply chains and ones that are sustainable. The best example is Alpha Solvay in the south of Scotland, who actually restarted production of PPE. And then post the initial phase, they won competitively a huge contract from the NHS in the midst of international competition. So we created and sustained resilient supply chains through that. So the next part I wanted to really touch on is how we take some of those lessons forward, some of those and do those conditions apply to part of our recovery. And there's 3 kind of sectors I'd like to have a little think about. The first one is the construction sector. So when it comes to recovery and coming out of recession, Scotland typically builds its way out of recession, whether it be through public sector house building, public sector investment into house building, large-scale infrastructure problems. We usually have a huge focus on construction. And if you look at the construction recovery plan that was delivered a couple of months ago, there's some fantastic stuff in there about digital transformation, about circular economy. And I think it's a real opportunity to do things differently in terms of construction recovery. I'm really interested, again, to get colleagues to start thinking about how do some of those conditions that applied to PPE apply to construction? Can we think about a national mission? How much certainty can we give the market in terms of demand signals and product specifications? When it comes to energy efficiency measures, etc. How can we actually access the business base really quickly? I think we can do that in the construction sector. And again, that point around how do we make sure funding and procurement is really clear. The second one, as everyone would imagine, is low carbon investment and the transition to net zero. That's the next industry we really need to think about. And the really important bit here is there's some really big bets starting to be made. So as part of the capital spending review and the infrastructure investment plan, the Scottish Government is going to be investing £2 billion over the next 5 years in low carbon, all brand new money. And that doesn't include the likes of 500 million already committed for active travel. That's a massive signal to the market. In that same time frame, Scottish Power alone are going to invest £10 billion. And that's going to be on products like heat pumps, electric vehicle charging points, hydrogen for large vehicles. We've got a massive shift coming in the market. Again, let's think about how we can create a national mission from this, give certainty to the market. And for Scotland, I think the fundamental piece is actually that we start to become a nation that manufactures a lot of this material. So resilient local supply chains. We can't afford Scotland to be a services industry when it comes to low carbon. And we can see the lessons from BiFab and others. I guess the third kind of sector really I'm keen to think about is again, health and the future of health and health products. And again, the kind of PPE experience has given us a real insight into that. The digitalization of the health service, you're going to have massive logistical rollouts of things like the COVID vaccine. And again, I think there's a lot of food for thought about how we take some of those lessons from the PPE experience and provide it to health in the long term. I've touched on manufacturing a few times, and I think manufacturing again comes to the heart of all of this. And the Scottish Government's manufacturing plan was just released last week, I think it was, or maybe even this week. And again, that's full of really interesting content from an innovation perspective. Digital transformation, circular economy, pivoting manufacturers from, some of our historic industrial processes like oil and gas to the new kind of technologies that will be coming through. So really interesting food for thought for colleagues in the innovation space. I mentioned the third kind of point I wanted to touch on today, conscious of time, is the innovation landscape that we find ourselves within. And I think this is something that's kind of pretty misunderstood at the moment within Scotland. I think there are some fantastic opportunities, and I think there are some real risks. So I'm going to start very quickly with the opportunities. Number one, there's a massive amount of investment has already been laid, but yet to be spent. So you think about the 12 city and growth deals. I've had the pleasure of working on all 12. There's £1 billion committed to innovation and innovation centres and innovation kind of assets within those city and growth deals. £1 billion. That is a massive amount of money. You think about the commitments made to Scotland's innovation districts. So the AMIDS district, Advanced Manufacturing and Innovation District, that will house NMIS and MMIC, £200 million of investment. Glasgow City Innovation District in the centre of Glasgow, led by Strathclyde University, £150 million will be committed to that. Glasgow University on the other side of in the west end of the city, £200 million committed to innovation districts there. Huge amounts of capital investment, and we need to be really aware of that, and we need to see that as an opportunity. I think an innovation culture is emerging in Scotland. I think we've got some fantastic players in that space. The innovation centres in Scotland who are doing terrific work. I think the likes of NMIS coming on stream, National Manufacturing Institute, with its own building, will have a really big role to play in this. And you've got other regional partners like the Oil and Gas Technology Centre, the work of Opportunity North East in the North East, some of the work around aquaculture on the West Coast. Again, it's bringing all those partners together, I think, is a real opportunity. In terms of some of the risks, and this is something we really need to be aware of, I think there's a huge risk of clutter and overlap, particularly amongst innovation centres and innovation buildings. I don't think Scotland can afford, back to Adam's point about our size, we can't afford a Darwinian kind of culture where it's survival of the fittest. We need all of these assets to work, which brings me to my second risk, which is the kind of rush to build buildings. I think in a recovery context, we need to think really clearly about how we utilise capital expenditure for innovation. And I think building the building is probably the last thing that you want to do. It's about back to the lessons of PPE, stimulating supply chains, working with business, creating those signals of demand. And then once the demand starts to flourish, that's when you perhaps need large buildings and sort of cathedrals of innovation that we're in danger of building. So I think there are some risks. Final one I'd mention is back to the point about innovation adoption, really, and innovation kind of growth. I think we're in a bit of a danger of innovation becoming simply about PhDs and research. We need it to be adopted into industry. I think our colleges have got a really big role there. I think growth of small businesses in terms of financial support is a big area we need to work on. And the emergence of the Scottish National Investment Bank should be a huge opportunity to fix some of that, to take us from ideas all the way through to kind of growing businesses. So A bit of a canter there through, again, innovation in a COVID setting, how we might take some of those lessons further forward, and the innovation landscape that I think we all kind of need to understand a little bit better if we're to make the most of the opportunities that are in front of us over the next 6 to 12 months, which should be a fascinating time. So I'll stop there, Charlie, and hopefully that chimed quite nicely with what Adam was talking about. And I think in the next speaker, we'll have some real examples of kind of some of the programs and projects in practice.
Great, David, thank you. And yeah, very much look forward to welcoming you onto the EDAS board. You covered a lot of ground there, but it was great to get your insights from that specific experience of working on the PPE project. Barbara, last but not least, over to you for your reflections, please.
Thank you, Charlie. And yeah, hopefully I'm going to be able to talk in a way that will pull together a few of the different things that have already been touched upon already. I am Barbara Mills. I'm the program manager at CivTech, and CivTech is an innovation program that sits within the Digital Directorate of the Scottish Government. And so my angle on this is very much looking at innovation from the point of view of what's the role that the public sector specifically can play in innovation for recovery. And as a program, we always think of ourselves as having dual objectives. Our first objective is to support the public sector organisations from across Scotland in improving their services through innovation. And the second is to support and to drive economic development through delivering that innovation through collaboratively solving challenges with the tech sector, particularly with bent to ensuring that our processes are able to enable anybody, to whether they're a startup or an established business, to be able to engage with the opportunities that we set. And basically what we are doing is we're running innovation challenges, and they're really, I guess, vehicles for the delivery of that mission-led innovation that Adam was talking about. And the challenges themselves represent ways that we can approach procurement differently from a public sector point of view that does give a clear demand signal to the market about what it is we are trying to achieve. To give you a very brief overview of how we do this, how we run these innovation challenges, we have a staged process, and it all starts with, our mantra is that we work with public sector organizations and we start with the problem they want to solve, not with the solution. And we set challenge statements. These are usually based around the idea of how can technology help us to, we've got a challenge this year that's all about trying to improve the efficiency of the COVID testing process, for example. And we invite people to come to us with their ideas of how they would solve these individual challenges. And we have all sorts of different challenges that we run. And in terms of the types of challenges we run, I think it's important to highlight something. Adam said earlier that innovation can mean a lot of different things. And when it comes to what we're looking at as a program, whilst we would recognize that there's been huge strides made in digital transformation, so the adoption of existing solutions, what we're looking to do as a program is look at where there are problems for which there are not existing solutions in the marketplace, because that represents a real problem for the public sector when thinking about how to go about buying solutions. They're faced with the issue of how do you procure what you don't know exists? And our answer is to take those challenges out to market. Now, we go through various stages of process where we're looking initially for ideas, and then we have small contracts where we're exploring a variety of those different ideas with several different businesses. Then we go into what we call, we use an accelerator model. It's 14 weeks of intensive development and a workshop program intended to support the development of the solutions that are going through the process. And the companies that are putting forward solutions to the challenges set they could be startups, they could be established businesses, but over those 14 weeks, they're expected to demonstrate that they can develop a prototype or minimum viable product, as we would call it. And if they can do that over those 14 weeks, you then have the opportunity to enter into a bigger contract. What this process does, going back to David's point earlier about how do we look at procurement differently, is it enables us as the public sector to engage on projects where there's a risk that what you're trying might not work. And therefore, we have a staged process where we're looking in small stages at developing and iterating the solutions that are under development, so that we're not committing to large scale contracts and we're managing the financial risks. But we're also supporting and hand-holding as a program, we're hand-holding the organizations we work with through this process. And so what I guess we would believe we've done at Civtec is we've demonstrated over 4 years now that we have got the kind of delivery vehicles that we can use to deliver mission-led innovation on behalf of the public sector. And it's not necessarily anything particularly new. The SBRI model, well established, taken over from the US, you've got it applied at a much larger scale there. But what that shows is that this type of approach can be used as a vehicle for driving large-scale economic development, and particularly focused on those SMEs and those businesses which we know are so important, those scale sectors of businesses which are so important to our economy. And so the question that I would have is kind of, it's to the public sector organizations and the third sector, across sectors really, in terms of, if we know we've got vehicles like this challenge-based model for innovation, what are the specific challenges that we could start collaborating on now that can actually help to drive that, that economic growth? Because we've got a huge range of areas we can tackle, and we're already, as I said, for looking at challenges around health. We've done some interesting work initially with construction, and actually the Construction Innovation Centre, looking at challenge-based approaches to how we can deliver challenges in that area. But is there more that we could do to actually look at innovative ways that we can deliver economic development? I'm really interested in thinking about how we might be able to tackle the ways we support businesses differently. When you look at the opportunities that fintech could present. It's also the case that when we're talking about recovery from the current crisis, what are the things that are the new, what's changed in the structure of our economy around things like childcare and workforce participation that might actually be the barriers to us achieving some of the kind of inclusive outcomes that Adam was talking about. And I think that if we are really to make the most of the opportunity to use a vehicle like challenge-based innovation that Civtec delivers, it's obvious that we as a nation are not in the luxury of the position in the US where you've got 11 federal agencies with research budgets of over £100 million. But if you look at the total spend across our organisation, our public sector in Scotland, and if you see how many opportunities there could be to engage in challenge-based approaches to innovation, and you accumulate that up at a national level, especially when you marry that alongside some of the conclusions of things like the Logan Report, I think there's a huge amount that we could do using the types of approach that CivTech has demonstrated it could deliver. And really, I'm keen to, as we look forward as a program, start seeing how we can use some of these vehicles for delivery more strategically, addressing the points that David has raised around clutter in the landscape. We will achieve much more with these types of approaches where we do set collaborative challenges that have strategic impact. But I think that we've got certainly some of the starting blocks that we need to be able to deliver some real value through the process. We know we can deliver. And I'm keen to get into those conversations with people about how we can do more with what we already know works.
Great, Barbara, thank you very much. I mean, this is very much starting point of the conversation as well. I like your idea about innovating in economic development. There's a real sort of physician heal thyself element to that. And as you say, you touched on a lot of the points that the others mentioned as well. I mean, Adam, talking in terms of his working culture around more focus on the how we do things, how we experiment. So you've all mentioned missions challenges in some way, and there've been a number of questions coming up within the chat function. If I can try and draw some of those together. I mean, I suppose the obvious one would be around the missions that we might choose, and picking up on David's point about the clarity of purpose in the whole PPE thing. You know, what sort of clear missions might be setting, but also then think about this point that Dermot's making in the chat about enabling conditions so it's not just a sort of top-down sort of this is the mission. It's what do you do that enables a more bottom-up activity at either a small company level or small community level to really take part in that mission. And I suppose in part of that, and Ian and Chris have touched on this as well, is the role that financing and intellectual property and the like play in that enablement. So there's a whole bunch of stuff there. David, do you want to, given your experience in the PPE, maybe kick us off, and then Adam, and then Barbara, maybe reflections on those points that are coming through?
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. It's one of those sessions where I feel like we could go on for about 6 hours here, and probably after 3 hours I might open a bottle of wine. It really is fascinating territory. I think, look, I think, you know, without getting too academic about it, I think missions don't have to be too complex. So the mission for PPE, as I say, you know, Mr. McKee, Ivan McKee, was really clear on the first call I attended. We need to quadruple ICU capacity in Scotland now, or people are going to die, right? And it's like, a lot of people have talked about innovation in the abstract. You need to innovate and think really quickly to get things done at that point. If you look at Mariana Mazzucato's work, actually, a lot of her theory, I mean, Adam will know this better than I do, but a lot of her theory was based around the American space missions, which is a really clear mission. We need to beat the Russians into space, right? We need to get the moon first. So I think missions for me don't have to be overly complex. A lot of people are talking about missions at the moment. There's a lot of strategy work going on in Scotland at the moment, loads and loads of strategy. And I think the famous term is culture eats strategy for breakfast. And actually delivery eats strategy for breakfast as well. We need to move very sharply from strategy to delivery. And that's where expertise like Barbara's outlined, where you've got trusted delivery agents who know what they're doing and know how to deliver programs, and have often delivered programs at quite a small scale, we need to start giving those organisations the ability to scale up. Trust ourselves. We did that in PPE. Back ourselves. Back the Scottish economy. Back the Scottish manufacturing capability. Back ourselves as innovators, and really go big in some of these areas. And I think that's when you'll start to see some real structural change. And, top mission. I mean, top mission is, Adam's laid it out. We can't afford to build back the way we were previously. We need to transition to a net zero economy. We need to create resilient supply chains in Scotland, and we need to create some jobs. So let's not overcomplicate it, and let's trust the delivery agents that we've got in place, I think.
Okay, good. Adam, so but yeah, a bit more thoughts on the how, and particularly the sort of the wider enablement then.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I kind of just want to repeat everything that David said, but I'll try and add to it if I can, because I agree with everything he said. So if I may pick up on a couple of additional points then. The first would be one of the, so at Nesta, we've sort of tried a whole bunch of different methods. In our language, we kind of call it innovation methodologies and whatnot. But over the last 20 years, we've tried and tested lots of different types of approaches to kind of social innovation. And one of the ones that sticks, because you'll appreciate some of them don't work, and because we're an endowed charity, we have the luxury of trying things knowing that they might not always work. But one of the ones that does stick and does work is what we call our people-powered results program, which is a people-powered approach to place-based local innovation that starts at the ground level. And it starts there even from the sort of the point of view of identifying, for the sake of today's conversation, the mission or the problem or the challenge, identifying what the thing is that communities want to solve, and then working with those communities in a kind of sprint methodology, 100-day challenge, we call it, to run at a problem to try and solve it. We've done some fantastic work in that regard in Midlothian here around young people in mental health services and access to mental health services. And that's just one example of many that we've run across the UK in recent years. But so I think there's something really to be said that innovation as a concept and as a theory and a practical thing can often get a bit kind of ivory tower. And I put my hands up, and Nesta's been guilty of that in the past for sure. It's one of my kind of pet hates, to be honest with you, because I believe that if this language is to have any actual real world meaning, it's got to be grounded in reality. It's got to be grounded in things that matter to people, and it can't be top down. It's got to be bottom up. Now, don't get me wrong, you do need the top down enabling environment. You need permission, you need resource, you need a kind of the authority to run at things. But I think people power ground up is incredibly important. One of the other points, and again, conscious of talking too much, but one of the other points is that's come up in the chat and in some of the conversations around financing. And just to expand on one of the things I linked to in the chat is my colleagues within Nesta in Wales run a thing called Our Lab, which I'm reliably informed just means the lab. But the Our Lab is a public service innovation lab in Wales that's a partnership between Nesta, Cardiff University and the Welsh Government. And they've done loads of really interesting work around repayable finance. And this is something that is, people will be familiar with, I'm sure, but it's another one of those Mazziano Mazzucato things that sort of alluded to a lot, is around the role of the government, not just in the transactional kind of give you money, do X sort of thing, which is where the narrative too often defaults to, but what is the role of public finance, whether it's repayable or not, in terms of unlocking the potential of other sectors. And so that's a lot of our lab's work has been around repayable finance to support innovation in the public sector, aligned to, I don't think they call it missions right enough when it was conceived, but it's broadly the same thing. The government would say, these are the things we want to fix. We're willing to put, X million in by way of repayable finance. We'll start with grant funding to unlock the proof of concept, and then we'll transition it into long-term repayable finance over, really, really long-term. At the moment, it's sort of 10, 15, 20 years, but they're even looking at, in some of the conversations, and I'm not as close to it, so I don't know if it's happened. I suspect, COVID like has got in the way of many things, but I know that they've had conversations around looking at 40-year repayable finance for some of the things that we're grappling with. And that's massive for the public sector, because that opens up a whole different way of solving problems, of bringing innovation to bear. So that mix of R&D grants and then delivery repayable finance is just one area of many that I think we could learn from in Scotland about how we work smarter with some of our public financing to support innovation for a social impact.
Yeah, great. Barbara, any reflections? Interesting, you mentioned the whole fintech thing, Barbara, and also I was intrigued there by your, Adam, your 100 days in the people power thing and the 14 weeks intensive development in your challenge approach, Barbara. So there's obviously something in that sort of timescale that's interesting. But any reflections on that?
No, I think in terms of the timescales aspect, and it echoes David's point earlier, I think about maybe not overcomplicating things. The important thing is to start, when it comes to innovation, it's starting to try something. And that's the whole idea behind having a short, it was actually 2 weeks this year. We're going to go back to 3 weeks, but we do initial 3-week exploration stages on our challenges. And if we get to the end of those and the solutions that we're working on looking like have tried something and we've explored something and we've identified it's not going to work, we're perfectly comfortable in stopping it. And that's part of the need to move quickly, is that obviously the longer your timescales are and the more protracted your time investment and people investment in something is, the harder it is to stay nimble and to also just be able to take the learnings from something when it doesn't work and move on from it and still have value in it, instead of look at something that hasn't worked in a sense of just the costs associated with it. If you could indulge me, I think in terms of Adam's points about involving, about how to do the sort of people-powered approach, we've experimented on something similar ourselves, where we had a citizen-defined challenge, and we had young people from Stirling, again on the issue of mental health, actually lead a procurement process. And if you told me that my career was going to include spending Saturdays hanging out with teenagers, talking to them about public procurement, at any point before I actually did it, I probably would have looked at you with some cynicism. But you know, it's this thing of, can we create a culture in which we're open to looking at doing things differently? And actually, when you look at the procurement setups, there's lots that you can do within the scope of the rules that can involve different ways of looking at how we not just define things like what our missions are, but how we involve different people at different stages in the processes. I think the main challenge, if I'm honest, that I see, particularly when it comes to net zero, actually, comes back to this issue of we value what we measure, and the ways that we measure things are so enshrined in a certain sort of approach, building on the references to Mariana Mazzucato. Mark Carney's recent Reith lecture was all around this issue of how putting a price on everything it misses so much of what we actually do value in society. And it comes back to this point on inclusion. If there's something I think we were a long way off cracking, it's about being able to quantify our priorities in terms of what we value. If you look at, there's been huge amounts of work done around this in relation to the environment, obviously already, but I think where it gets much harder is when we are looking at some of these questions of what are we recovering to, and how do we do things like address the issues around inequality and inclusion when the way that we value people isn't quantified in any other way than their contribution to GDP or GVA. And that for me is actually, in strategic terms, probably one of the biggest hardest things for us to tackle. We've started looking at how we can do that in terms of our own ROI, but it's definitely massively challenging.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And thank you all, actually. I mean, as David said, this is a conversation that could have gone on for a lot longer, but it was really just a start of what I hope will be a continuing conversation, particularly as this is probably the last of the COVID conversations, and I think what we're going to be doing next year is looking towards organising a series of events around how do we make any recovery more sustainable, more inclusive, and so we'll be looking to develop some of the things that have been touched on here in this conversation today. But there's been huge, really rich amount of material. David also reminded us that culture eats strategy, and as an ex-strategy director, I can confirm that that is definitely the case. So actually building the sort of culture that all three of you have described is one of the, I suppose, one of the missions that will then be an enabler for the more specific missions that we look to pursue. But no, thank you all very much for your contributions. Conscious of we're getting towards 3 o'clock now, where I promised we'd finish. We're recording this, so and we'll capture some of the other comments that have come up in the chat as well. Thank you to everyone that's contributed to that. Thank you to Elaine and Alison, who have organised this and all our events during the course of the year in their own brilliant style. Very, very much appreciated. Well, we look forward to seeing you next year. I think all it remains is for me to hope you have a very enjoyable festive season, and hopefully see you in a slightly more normal, but very much very, very different 2021. Thank you all very much. Bye for now.
Thank you.